Of all the ghosts that haunt the quiet corridors of memory, the night of the party is the most persistent. It does not rattle chains or whisper from the shadows. It simply stands in the full glare of recollection, a wound perpetually fresh. The sound is what returns first, a symphony of trivialities, the crystalline chime of glass on glass, the low, undifferentiated hum of conversation, the thrum of a bass line bleeding through the walls like a distant, anxious heartbeat. These were the ambient noises of my own immolation. It was meant to be a reprieve, a brief armistice in our cold war of quiet disappointments. A night to perform the rituals of normalcy, to reconnect with the people who still believed we were the couple from the wedding photos, maybe even to reconnect with the fading specters of ourselves. Instead, it became the fulcrum upon which our lives pivoted, tilting us into a new and terrifying landscape. I watched Sophia prepare as if observing a stranger. There was a feverish energy to her movements, a meticulous devotion to the craft of her own presentation. The ritual was not for me. I had become part of the scenery of her life, a familiar piece of furniture, a sturdy, dependable armchair you no longer truly see but would notice if it were gone. She selected a dress of black sequins, a garment that seemed woven from captured fragments of the night sky. With every slight turn of her body, it fractured the light, 1,000 tiny, indifferent eyes winking back at the world. It was a declaration, a statement of intent, and I was not its intended audience. A corrosive whisper had been growing in the back of my mind for months, a voice that told me I was living in the past tense of our relationship. I had tried to silence it, to dismiss it as the paranoia of a man sensing his own obsolescence. That night, the whisper became a roar. Caleb's mansion was, as always, a monument to transient pleasures. Chandeliers dripped with counterfeit starlight, casting a honeyed, forgiving glow over the assembled crowd. Waitstaff, clad in funereal black, moved like wraiths through the throng, their silver trays laden with flutes of champagne that seemed to capture and hold the ambient light. Caleb himself materialized at the door, his grin as wide and shallow as a summer creek. He was already several drinks into his role as magnanimous host, his voice a booming performance of bonhomie. "Ethan, Sophia, you made it." He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of hollow familiarity, before his attention swiveled entirely to my wife. His gaze was a physical thing, tracing the lines of the sequin dress with an ownership that was entirely unearned. "Sophia, you look like a goddamn supernova." I dismissed it. Caleb's flirtations were part of his brand, as predictable and harmless as a house cat's pawing. He knew the lines, the unspoken treaties that governed our social ecosystem. He knew better than to cross one with me. The evening began its slow, deceptive unfurling. I drifted into the orbit of familiar conversations, exchanging meaningless pleasantries about work and the weather, a social automaton going through the motions. Sophia, however, did not drift. She soared. She was a master of this environment, moving from one conversation to another with an effortless grace that left a wake of charmed smiles. She thrived under the collective gaze of the room, drawing energy from it like a flower turning toward the sun. I once found this quality intoxicating. Tonight, it felt like a betrayal. Her laughter seemed pitched a half-note higher, her gestures more theatrical, her entire being calibrated for maximum visibility. She was not merely being social, she was broadcasting, and I soon saw for whom the signal was intended. His name was Damien. He materialized across the room, a study in curated nonchalance. He possessed the kind of effortless charisma that seemed both a gift and a weapon. Sharp, angular features, hair that fell with a sculptor's precision, and a way of leaning into a conversation that created an immediate, impenetrable bubble of intimacy. An artist, they called him, a title that seemed to grant him a permanent hall pass from the mundane responsibilities of life. He was adored by many and tolerated by me. I found his brand of bohemian self-importance insufferable. They stood together, a tableau of quiet conspiracy against the roaring backdrop of the party. At first, I rationalized it. Sophia was a social creature. Damien was a part of her circle. A conversation. Nothing more. But the minutes bled into one another, and their proximity remained unchanged, hardening from a casual chat into something more deliberate. I watched him lean in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear as he whispered some private joke. Sophia's response was a peal of laughter so unrestrained, so utterly joyous, that it sent a shard of ice through my gut. Then, her hand came to rest on his forearm. A small gesture, perhaps, but it was the geography of it, the casual possession, the lingering touch, that spoke volumes. It was an intimacy not meant for public consumption, yet performed on center stage. The knot in my stomach, a familiar companion these last few months, cinched tighter. My own conversations became a series of disconnected sounds. I nodded and smiled, my mind 1,000 miles away, my eyes tethered to the drama unfolding across the room. Rachel, my oldest friend and the closest thing I had to a confidant in that room, materialized at my elbow. Her voice was a low murmur against the party's din. "Everything okay, Ethan?" I manufactured a smile. It felt like a mask made of cheap plastic. "Yeah, what?" She gave me a look that communicated, with devastating clarity, that she was not buying it. "You've been staring at them for the last 10 minutes. You look like you're about to commit a felony." What could I say? That I felt the foundations of my life cracking in real time? That I was watching my wife, the woman who shared my bed and my name, offer up the parts of herself I thought were reserved for me to another man? That my fear of being wrong was eclipsed only by my terror of being right? I said nothing. Then, the music shifted. The upbeat tempo dissolved into something slower, a sultry, blues-infused melody that seemed to thicken the air. Without a flicker of hesitation, Damien extended his hand to Sophia. A single, heartbeat-long pause, a moment where the entire world seemed to hold its breath, and then she took it. He led her to the center of the room, a space that cleared for them as if by unspoken command. I was frozen, a statue in a collapsing museum. Their dance was not the awkward, shuffling embrace of friends. It was a conversation held in the language of bodies. They moved as one entity, their hips swaying in a rhythm that was both elegant and obscene. Their chemistry was a palpable force, a static charge that crackled in the air and drew the eyes of everyone in the room. The ambient hum of conversation died, replaced by a ripple of whispers, a venomous hiss that slithered through the crowd. Caleb's voice, loud and laced with a nervous tremor, attempted to puncture the tension. "Well, looks like Damien's still got the moves, huh?" His laughter was brittle and hollow, a sound that shattered against the profound awkwardness of the moment. I did not laugh. I could not move. My hands, shoved deep into my pockets, were balled into fists, my knuckles white and aching. I was in exile in my own life, watching the queen of my dismantled kingdom dance with a usurper. When the song finally bled into silence, the applause was not triumphant. It was the scattered, uncertain clapping of an audience that had witnessed something deeply private and unsettling. Sophia and Damien seemed oblivious, or perhaps they simply didn't care. She threw her head back and laughed again, the sound now grating and alien to my ears, utterly deaf to the silent scream of my humiliation. The rest of the night is a blur of fractured images and overheard phrases. The party's focus had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer about Caleb's hospitality or the reunion of friends. It was about Sophia and Damien. The whispers became the new soundtrack, following us as we finally made our exit. In the car, a cocoon of suffocating silence, she sat beside me, her face illuminated by the cold, blue light of her phone, scrolling as if the last hour had been nothing more than a pleasant dream. I did not speak. To open my mouth would be to unleash a torrent of rage so vast it would sweep us both away. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles straining against the leather, and a single, cold thought solidified in my mind, looping over and over again. By the end of the night, she was the talk of the town. But she was not going to like the reasons why. The morning after felt like a ceasefire in a war no one had declared. The silence in our house was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that carried the specific gravity of things unsaid. Upstairs, Sophia slept. She slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the righteous or the profoundly unaware. Her hair was a dark spill across the white pillowcase, a picture of serene innocence that felt like a calculated mockery of the inferno raging inside me. I sat at the kitchen table, a sentinel guarding a cold cup of coffee. My mind was a cinema of horrors, replaying the previous night on a relentless loop. The laughter, the whispers, her hand in his. It wasn't just the public humiliation that gnawed at me. It was her complete and utter detachment. It was the chilling realization that in the grand theater of her life, I had been demoted from co-star to a nameless extra, perhaps even an obstacle in the scenery. My phone buzzed, a jarring intrusion into the sanctum of my anger. A text from Rachel. Asterisk, you okay? Call me if you want to talk. Asterisk, I stared at the words, a small island of empathy in a sea of betrayal. She had seen it all, had borne witness to my silent disintegration. She had tried to throw me a conversational lifeline, to pull me away from the spectacle, but I had been transfixed, a moth drawn to the flame of my own destruction. Another buzz. Caleb. Asterisk, hey man, sorry about last night. Weird vibe. Call me if you want to grab a drink and vent. Asterisk, Caleb, the self-appointed Switzerland of our social circle. His well-meaning neutrality was a source of constant frustration, a refusal to acknowledge that some hills were, in fact, worth dying on. His text was an offer of commiseration, but I knew it came with an implicit plea to smooth things over, to maintain the delicate social equilibrium he so cherished. Sophia finally descended, a wraith in a silk robe. She moved into the kitchen with a studied casualness that set my teeth on edge. Her face was a mask of placid normality. Morning, she said, her voice light, airy, an impossible sound in the dense atmosphere of the room. I didn't answer immediately. I remained leaning against the counter, my arms crossed, a pose of deliberate confrontation. I watched her pour coffee, her movements fluid and unburdened. She didn't look at me, and that simple act of avoidance was more painful than a direct blow. Do you have anything you want to say to me? I finally asked. My voice was dangerously calm, each word a carefully placed stone. She paused, the cup halfway to her lips. About what? A laugh escaped me, sharp and devoid of humor. Don't play dumb, Sophia. About last night. About Damien. About the fact that you turned our marriage into a spectator sport for all our friends to enjoy. Her brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her features. She mirrored my stance, crossing her arms in a defensive posture. It was just a dance, Ethan. You're making this into something it's not. Just a dance? I repeated, the control I held over my voice beginning to fray. You ignored me for 3 solid hours. You didn't just dance with him, Sophia, you draped yourself over him. You performed for him. Do you have any conception of how that looked? Of how that made me look? She sighed, a theatrical exhalation of exasperation, and rolled her eyes. The gesture was so dismissive, so belittling, that it felt like a lit match dropped into a pool of gasoline. My blood boiled. You're being dramatic, Ethan. Damien and I were having fun. That's what people are supposed to do at parties. Fun, I snapped, pushing myself off the counter, closing the distance between us. Is that what you call it? Humiliating your husband in front of 24 people you call your friends? Is that your idea of fun? For the first time, her expression faltered. A shadow of guilt, fleeting but undeniable, crossed her face before being replaced by a hardened resolve. I didn't mean to embarrass you, she said, her tone softening, a transparently tactical shift. But you can't keep blaming me for everything, Ethan. Maybe if you loosened up once in a while, if you weren't so rigid, I wouldn't have to look for excitement elsewhere. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The air left my lungs. Look for excitement elsewhere. It was a confession wrapped in an accusation, a masterpiece of deflection. I stared at her, the woman I had built a life with, and saw a stranger. Excitement elsewhere. I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Is that what he is to you, Sophia? Excitement. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her gaze fell to the polished floorboards, a silent admission that was more damning than any word she could have spoken. The rest of the day was a wasteland of silence. I retreated to my office, creating a fortress of work emails and spreadsheets, anything to create a buffer against the raw wound of her words. The texts from Rachel and Caleb continued to arrive, each one a fresh reminder of the public theater our private life had become. By evening, the gossip had metastasized, spreading beyond the confines of the party guests. I received a call from James, an old college friend who hadn't even been there. Ethan, he began, his tone cautious. I don't want to pry, man, but is everything okay with you and Sophia? I'm hearing some things. We're fine. I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. Nothing was fine. My wife had auditioned for the role of another man's lover in public and then blamed me for her performance. And now, our life was fodder for the idle gossip of people who knew nothing about the slow, agonizing decay that had led us to this point. That night, lying in bed, the space between us a vast and frozen tundra, I stared at the ceiling and felt an unnerving clarity. Where had it gone wrong? The question was a labyrinth with no exit. But a new, more urgent question began to form. Was this the beginning of the end, or was the end already here, and I was just the last to know? Sophia's refusal to take accountability, her casual dismissal of my pain, was not just a symptom of a problem. It was the problem itself. And if she wouldn't give me the truth, I would have to excavate it myself. The quiet that followed our confrontation was not a peaceful one. It was the tense, watchful silence of a battlefield after the first bloody skirmish, with both sides retreated to their trenches, plotting their next move. Sophia moved through our home with an air of defiant normalcy, a performance of unwavering confidence that felt like a continuous, passive-aggressive assault. I, in turn, retreated into a cold, methodical anger. Actions, I have always believed, resonate far louder than words. Her actions had broadcast her indifference. My actions would now be a search for the truth she was so determined to obscure. My investigation began not with suspicion, but with a deep, gnawing need to understand the architecture of my own ruin. Who was Damien Parker? I knew him only in caricature. The charming artist, the social butterfly Sophia had met through Caleb. His ascent from a peripheral acquaintance to the epicenter of our marital crisis had been insidious and, from my vantage point, almost invisible until it was too late. My first call was to James. He was more than my lawyer. He was a pragmatist, a man who saw the world in terms of evidence and motive. When I laid out the situation, stripped of its emotional baggage and presented as a problem to be solved, he didn't offer platitudes. He offered a plan. Damien Parker, he mused, the sound of his keyboard clicking softly in the background. The name rings a bell. A bit of a social chameleon, isn't he? Always seems to land on his feet. That's one way of putting it, I said, pacing the length of my office. I need to know what's under the surface. Nothing illegal, just the public record. The whispers. The stories people tell when he's not in the room. Give me a couple of days, James said, his voice all business. I'll see what skeletons are hanging in his closet. While James delved into the digital ether, I began my own, more delicate reconnaissance. I used Caleb as my unwitting informant. During a phone call ostensibly about a business matter, I steered the conversation toward the party. He and Sophia certainly seemed to hit it off, I said, my tone a careful study and casual curiosity. There was a telling pause on the other end. Ethan, you know Damien, Caleb finally said, his voice laced with caution. He's like that with everyone. He's just friendly. Don't read too much into it. Friendly with everyone. Asterisk, it was the classic defense of a man who prioritizes social harmony above all else. A verbal shrug designed to invalidate my concerns. Caleb wasn't just defending Damien. He was defending the comfortable, unexamined world they both inhabited. My conversation with Rachel was a different matter entirely. Over coffee in a place where we were unlikely to be seen, I asked her point blank, "What's your real opinion of Damien?" Rachel's expression soured. She set her cup down and leaned forward, her voice low. "I think he's a predator, Ethan. I've never trusted him." "Why?" She hesitated, her eyes scanning the cafe. "He has a reputation. It's not something people talk about openly, but he collects people, especially women who are unhappy or feeling neglected. He finds the cracks in a relationship and wedges himself in. It's a game to him. He enjoys the chaos." A game. Asterisk, the word landed like a stone in my gut. Was that what Sophia was to him? A new challenge? A prize to be won not for her own sake, but for the thrill of the conquest? A few days later, James called back. His tone was grim. "You were right to be suspicious. Parker's got a trail of messes behind him." He detailed 2 separate lawsuits from former clients for breach of contract. Art commissions paid for, but never delivered. More damning, however, was the personal history he'd uncovered. He was the other man in a very messy divorce a few years ago. The husband tried to sue him for alienation of affection. It didn't stick, but the court documents paint a very clear picture. Damien played the innocent, sensitive artist, but witness testimonies show he was actively instigating the conflict, feeding the wife's resentments against her husband. The pieces clicked into place, forming a portrait of a meticulous, emotional arsonist. He didn't just stumble into chaos, he created it. He found vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. And Sophia, with her craving for attention and her simmering discontent, had been the perfect target. That evening, I confronted her again. She was on the couch, her phone a familiar shield. "We need to talk," I said, planting myself in front of her, blocking the television. She sighed, her martyrdom on full display. "What now, Ethan?" "I've been doing some research on Damien." I watched her face for a reaction. "Did you know about the lawsuits? About the other marriages he's interfered with?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine shock. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about his pattern, Sophia. I'm talking about the trail of broken relationships he leaves in his wake. This isn't a coincidence. He's dangerous, and if you can't see that, you're either willfully blind or you're a part of it." Her face paled. "Ethan, I didn't know." "Didn't you?" I pressed my voice hard. "Or did you just choose not to see? Did his attention feel so good that you decided not to ask any of the important questions?" She had no answer. The silence that filled the room was a confession. For the first time since the party, I saw a crack in her armor, a glimmer of the terrified, uncertain woman beneath the defiant facade. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. "I am not going to stand by and watch this man detonate our lives," I said, my voice low and resolute. "So you need to make a choice. It's him, or it's me." I walked away without waiting for her reply, the ultimatum hanging in the air between us like a guillotine. I wasn't sure she knew the answer, and the terrifying part was, I wasn't sure I did either. The battle lines, once invisible, were now drawn in stark relief. My quiet inquiry into Damien's past had sent tremors through our social circle, forcing our friends out of their comfortable neutrality. Allegiances were being tested, and sides were being chosen. The fracture was most apparent with Caleb. He called me, his voice tight with a frustration he barely tried to conceal. "Ethan, what the hell is this I'm hearing? You've got James digging into Damien's past. That's crossing a line, man." "The line was crossed at your party, Caleb," I replied, my patience worn thin. "I'm just trying to understand who I'm dealing with." "He's not a bad guy. He's just misunderstood," Caleb insisted, his defense sounding rehearsed and hollow. "He's a predator who targets vulnerable women." "How is that misunderstood?" "You sound paranoid," he shot back. "You're turning this into some grand conspiracy. It was a dance, for God's sake. Let it go." It was then I realized Caleb wasn't defending Damien, the man. He was defending the idea of his world, a world where things were simple, where friendships were uncomplicated, and where messy truths could be swept under the rug. My investigation threatened that world, and for that, he could not forgive me. Sophia's closest friend, Lila, was a different story. At a charity luncheon we were obligated to attend, she pulled me aside, her expression a mixture of anxiety and resolve. "I don't know all the details of what's happening with you and Sophia," she began, her voice a near whisper. "But you need to know, you're not wrong about Damien." Her admission took me by surprise. "What do you mean?" "He's poison, Ethan," she said, her eyes darting around the room. "I've seen him operate before. He finds a weakness, a point of insecurity, and he hammers at it until everything shatters. He's charming, he's magnetic, and he is profoundly dangerous." "Then why haven't you warned Sophia?" I asked, a surge of frustration rising in me. "I tried," she said, her face etched with regret. "A long time ago, but she didn't want to hear it. She accused me of being jealous. When it comes to him, she's different." "Different?" The word echoed Rachel's sentiment, confirming my deepest fears. Damien wasn't just a flirtation, he was an addiction, and Sophia was in its throes. The true schism occurred at a dinner party at Rachel and James's house. The guest list was small, a curated collection of the core group. Us, them, Caleb, and Lila. The tension was a palpable entity at the table, a seventh guest seated amongst us. Caleb was pointedly ignoring me, while Rachel and James flanked me, a silent show of solidarity. Lila picked at her food, caught in the crossfire between her loyalty to Sophia and her knowledge of the truth. It was Caleb, predictably, who lit the match. "So, he said, his voice dripping with false casualness as he refilled his wine glass. Are we all just going to pretend that Ethan isn't running a private investigation on one of our friends? Rachel placed her fork down with a deliberate click. Maybe the more interesting question, Caleb, is why he felt he needed to. Sophia, seated beside me, went rigid. This isn't the time or place, she muttered. Isn't it? Caleb pressed on, his face flushed. I mean, come on, Sophia. You can't be okay with this. He's digging through Damien's life. It's invasive. It was necessary. I interjected, my voice level. Damien is not who he pretends to be, and deep down, Caleb, you know that. You just don't want to admit it because it would disrupt your perfect little social order. Blind, he sputtered. Or maybe I'm just not paranoid enough to believe every bit of gossip that comes my way. This isn't gossip. Rachel cut in, her tone sharp as steel. It's a pattern of behavior. A pattern that is repeating itself right now, with Sophia. The sound of Sophia's chair scraping against the hardwood floor silenced the table. She stood, her hands trembling. Enough, she said, her voice shaking with a volatile mix of anger and humiliation. I am not a victim. I am not some pawn in your theories. Damien is my friend. That's all. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unconvincing. The denial was so absolute, so desperate, that it served only to confirm her complicity. The dinner party disintegrated after that. Caleb left in a huff, muttering about drama. Lila slipped away with a pained look in my direction. When Sophia and I finally drove home, the silence in the car was absolute. It was no longer the silence of unresolved anger, but the silence of a chasm that had grown too wide to cross. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the fiction that this was all a grand misunderstanding. But the evidence, and the divided loyalties of our friends, told a different story. As I lay awake that night, I understood that this was no longer just about Damien. It was about whether the woman sleeping beside me was someone I even knew anymore. In the tense aftermath of the dinner party, a strange coalition began to form. While Caleb retreated into willful ignorance, Rachel, James, and now Lila became my co-conspirators. Our mission was no longer simply to convince Sophia, but to orchestrate a reckoning. Damien thrived in the shadows, in the gray areas of plausible deniability. We had to drag him into the light. You can't just confront him with accusations, James advised during a late-night strategy session in his study. He'll twist it. He'll paint you as a jealous, controlling husband. We need irrefutable proof. We need testimony. That's when he brought up Ava. She was the woman from the divorce case a few years ago. I reached out through a colleague. She's been silent for years, terrified of what Damien might do to her reputation if she spoke out. But she might be willing to talk now, if she knew she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Lila, burdened by her own past with Damien, a story she had yet to fully share, offered to play a dangerous game. He trusts me, she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He thinks I'm on his side, that I see Sophia as a friend he's helping through a tough time. I can get closer. He's arrogant. He'll brag, if given the chance. It was a perilous strategy, but it was our best shot. Over the next week, Lila masterfully played her part, meeting Damien for coffee, listening to his self-aggrandizing stories about his art and his conquests. She reported back to us each night, her findings painting an even darker portrait of the man. He sees it all as a rescue mission, she told me, her voice laced with disgust. He talks about liberating Sophia from our stifling marriage. He genuinely believes he's the hero of this story. He even boasted about how easy it is to win someone over if you just mirror their own dissatisfactions back at them. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Ava agreed to meet with me. We sat in a quiet, anonymous cafe, and she recounted her story. It was a harrowing echo of what was happening to Sophia. The initial charm, the creation of a secret world, the slow poisoning of her marriage, and the vicious character assassination he launched when she tried to break it off. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the world who truly understands him, she said, her hands wrapped around a cold teacup. And by the time you realize it's an act, you're so isolated you don't know who to turn to. If my story can prevent that from happening to someone else, then I have to tell it. Armed with Ava's testimony, Lila's insider reports, and James's documented evidence, we had what we needed. The plan was audacious. We would convene another gathering at Caleb's house. the scene of the original crime. Caleb, intrigued by the promise of definitive drama, agreed to host. The stage was set for a confrontation, not of angry accusations, but of cold, hard facts. The evening arrived, thick with unspoken tension. Damien was in his element, holding court near the bar, radiating a smug confidence. He greeted Sophia with a familiar kiss on the cheek, a gesture of ownership that made me see red. But I held my composure. Rachel and James took up quiet positions around the room. Lila stayed close to Damien, her final performance as his confidant. And near the French doors, almost hidden in the shadows, stood Ava. After an hour of strained socializing, I made my move. It's a fascinating thing, trust. I began, my voice carrying across the sudden lull in conversation. Every eye turned to me. Damien smirked, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Getting philosophical on us, Ethan? Just practical, I said, meeting his gaze. It's the currency of every relationship. And when someone turns out to be a counterfeiter, it's only a matter of time before their deception is exposed. His smirk wavered. That's a heavy accusation. Care to elaborate? Gladly, I said. I laid out the case, not with anger, but with the dispassionate precision of a prosecutor. I spoke of his pattern. James stepped forward and presented Caleb with a folder containing the financial and legal documents. Rachel spoke of the other women she'd discovered he'd been targeting with the same flirtatious messages. Lila described, in chilling detail, how he had bragged to her about manipulating Sophia's emotions. Damien tried to laugh it off, to dismiss it as a coordinated attack. But then, Ava stepped out of the shadows. He did the same thing to me, she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through his blustering denials. He charmed me, he isolated me, and he tried to destroy me when I walked away. I trusted you, Damien, and you used that trust to try and tear my life apart. The room was utterly silent. Damien's mask of charm finally shattered, revealing the ugly, panicked face beneath. Sophia's face was ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. She was looking at him, truly looking at him for the first time, not as a charming savior, but as the manipulative predator we had just exposed. This is insane, Damien spat, his voice shrill. A witch hunt. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, and found none. Every face was turned against him, a jury that had already reached its verdict. He stormed toward the door, shoving past a guest in his haste to escape the suffocating weight of the truth. The slam of the door echoed in the stunned silence. The spell was broken. Caleb let out a low whistle. Well, I guess you were right. I ignored him. My attention was fixed on Sophia. She was staring at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of shame, regret, and something else I couldn't yet name. Ethan, she whispered, the word barely audible. I didn't know. Yes, you did, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. A part of you did. You just didn't want to see. The drive home was a mirror of the one weeks before, yet fundamentally different. The silence was not born of anger, but of shock. The lies had been stripped away, and we were left with the raw, painful, and undeniable truth. The confrontation had destroyed Damien, but the real question remained. Had it come in time to save us? In the aftermath, our world resettled, but the landscape had irrevocably changed. Damien vanished from our social orbit like a ghost at sunrise. The whispers about him now were not of his charm, but of his deceit. Caleb, humbled and apologetic, became a tentative friend once more. But these were peripheral concerns. The true reconstruction had to happen within the four walls of our home, in the vast, silent spaces between Sophia and me. She was different. The defiant, defensive shell had crumbled, leaving behind a woman I barely recognized, fragile, quiet, and profoundly lost. For days, we moved around each other, speaking only of household logistics, the air thick with the ghosts of everything we couldn't yet bring ourselves to say. The breakthrough came one evening on the porch. The sun had set, streaking the sky in hues of bruised purple and pale orange. I was nursing a whiskey, staring into the twilight, when she came out and sat in the chair beside me. I don't know where to begin, she said, her voice small. The truth is usually a good place, I replied, not unkindly. She took a deep, shaky breath. I was wrong. About everything. About him. I let his attention become a drug, and I ignored every red flag because I didn't want the high to end. I needed to feel seen. Her voice broke on the last word. I let myself believe that the problem was you, that our marriage was the cage, because it was easier than admitting the truth. Which is, I prompted, turning to look at her. Tears traced paths down her cheeks, glinting in the faint light from the house. That I was the problem. I was unhappy with myself. I felt invisible because I had made myself small. And instead of doing the hard work to fix it, I looked for an easy escape. She finally met my eyes, her own filled with a raw, devastating honesty. I'm so scared that I've broken us beyond repair. That I've lost you for good. For weeks, my heart had been a fortress of anger. But her vulnerability was a quiet siege, dismantling my defenses stone by stone. I saw not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman who had lost her way, the woman I had once promised to protect. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Sophia, I said, the words heavy and true. But if you're willing to do the work, I'm willing to try. Anything, she whispered, a promise and a plea. I'll do anything. That conversation was not an end, but a beginning. We started counseling. The sessions were brutal, excavating years of buried resentments and unspoken disappointments. We learned that Damien was not the cause of our problems, but a symptom of a sickness that had been festering for years, my emotional distance, her need for external validation, our shared failure to communicate. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to build something new from the rubble. She threw herself into the process with a ferocity I hadn't seen in years, not for an audience, but for herself. For us, she reconnected with our children, with Lila, with the parts of herself she had neglected. I, in turn, had to learn to let go of my anger, to see her actions not as a personal attack, but as the flawed choices of a person in pain. I started to meet her in the middle, to be present in a way I hadn't been before. The walls didn't vanish overnight, but small windows began to appear, letting in shafts of light. Months later, we were sitting on the couch, the house quiet after the kids were asleep. An easy silence had settled between us, a comfortable quiet that had once been impossible. Thank you, she said softly, turning to me, for not giving up on me. I took her hand, her skin warm against mine. Thank you, I replied, for giving me a reason not to. It was not a fairy tale ending. The scars of that time would always remain, faint, pale lines against the skin of our marriage, a reminder of the wound we had survived. But our relationship was no longer the fragile, neglected structure it had been. It had been tested by fire, stripped down to its foundations, and was now being rebuilt, brick by painful, deliberate brick. It was stronger. It was more honest. It was ours. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like we were finally home.